everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Okay, I want to thank you so much today. I'm Julia Wester. I am the CEO and co-founder of 55 Degrees. We're hosting this webinar today. 55 Degrees is the home of some lean, agile applications that help you get more work done with less stress and try to help you optimize the amount of value that you can deliver to customers and stakeholders. And it's not surprising that Actionable Agile is our flagship product. And we have here with us today the father of Actionable Agile and the face still of the Actionable Agile brand, Daniel Vacanti. And we work with Daniel very, very closely on still the strategic direction of our flow-based apps and Actionable Agile. And I'm so glad to have been able to invite him here today. If you haven't noticed, he recently wrote a 9-part blog series on Little's Law. So as much as you could really want to or need to or possibly care about knowing about Little's Law, he wrote that content for your consumption, sort of on demand. And I asked him here today to really walk us through what's important about Little's Law, what you need to know, how you should use it, if you should use it, just all the dirty little secrets about Little's Law and what we should do going forward. I want to thank Dan for being here today, and I want to just turn everything over to you, Dan, and let you sort of lead us through. But thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. I don't have a ton, well, and I should actually correct it. I don't have any prepared remarks. Actually, I was hoping this would be more kind of a Q&A. People come with their questions. I can start us off with a little bit. The blog series that I wrote, believe it or not, I probably left out more than I'd put in. So even though it is kind of a 9-part series, a lot was left out. And we can maybe talk about some of the stuff that was left out. Either on purpose or for the sake of expediency, or maybe more importantly for the sake of interest, because you can go as deep as you want on this, as deep as you can, or as deep as you want. Just to start us off, I was telling Julia about this earlier. It's interesting. The more I write about why Little's Law is not important, the more questions I get about Little's Law. And so maybe I should just stop writing about it, because I don't know. It just seems like the theme, if anybody read, and hopefully all of you read the blog series, the theme of that blog series is like the Little's Law, certainly as the equation, doesn't matter. It's just not really useful in our world, and you really shouldn't care about it. The only thing that's really interesting about Little's Law, from my perspective anyway, is the assumptions under which it works, and how well are you operating your process based on, on the assumptions that makes Little's Law work. That's really all you should care about. Plugging numbers into an equation and doing all that is, there's all kinds of problems with that in our kind of lean agile world, that really just doesn't make any sense. So I guess I'm hoping, and I don't know if it's Julia or Utilai or whomever is going to help me facilitate kind of a question and answer, but I'd really like to open it up and, either unmute yourself, or if you're allowed to unmute yourself, I don't know if you're allowed to unmute yourself, and ask a question or raise your hand or put something in chat or whatever. I don't know, but yeah. If anybody has anything to kind of get us going, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and so in this webinar, you can enter questions into the Q&A section of Zoom. In your Zoom control panel, you'll find Q&A. And so we have our first question, Dan. How would you explain Little's Law to a 5th grader?
I'm not sure I would.
Pretend you would.
I would say the more things that you work on average, the longer it's going to take each of those things to complete on average. The problem even with that statement is if you're talking to a 5th grader, and if we're saying most agilists have the minds of 5th graders, I don't know if we're saying that or not. This is being recorded, so maybe I shouldn't say that. The problem, most people think, at least in the English speaking world, I've found that a lot of people will substitute, when I say average, they will substitute typical, right? Like the typical or the common or whatever. And anybody who's studied any math or maths, depending on where you're from, knows that average is anything but typical. In fact, average is fairly abnormal. It's kind of hard to get exactly the average. So so when we say, on average, working on more stuff, it's each of those things are going to take longer on average. We're not saying typically, right? The typical item going through is just saying, on average across a huge set of stuff. I don't know if that helps or not, but yeah.
Yeah, we have the next question. I think playing off of something you said. We're asked, I know the value of the assumptions for Little's law and that it will never be exact, but is the formula itself valuable at all to use as measurement tool to see how predictable you have been, or is that discouraged?
Personally, I would say it's very, very, very much discouraged, just because it is a relationship of averages, and maybe I might be assuming too much here, but because it's a relationship of averages, the second, if there's maybe one thing that I could get everybody in the Agile world to understand, is that the second that you hear the word average, you immediately have to think flaw of averages. You immediately have to think that. And that an average as a number, Dr. Wheeler says this best. I've been trying to find the exact reference, and if I ever do find it, I'll get it back to you. But Dr. Donald Wheeler says an average is a measure of location, not of magnitude. So all an average is telling you is the center of the population of stuff that you have. It tells you almost nothing about that underlying population. It just tells you where that center is. And so, and when I say it's not a magnitude, if we say our average cycle time is, say, 8 days, again, that really doesn't tell you anything. That doesn't tell your process, the typical item flowing through your process is 8 days. It just tells you the center of all the data that you've gathered is 8 days. So just because we're plugging numbers into an equation and it comes out or it doesn't come out, doesn't tell us if we're being predictable or not. It really gives us almost no information about that. If you are operating your process under Little's law's assumptions, then you've got a shot at being predictable, but it doesn't mean that you are, or that you have been, or that you will be. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So are you saying then that the assumptions behind the formula are more valuable than the formula itself?
Yeah, I'm 100% saying that. In our context, there might be other contexts. I mean, the original reason why it was fairly important for Little to go out and prove this relationship was there are many contexts where two of the parameters, but you don't know the third. And the third one is it's either really hard to calculate, really hard to measure, really expensive to measure, prohibitive to measure in whatever way. For whatever reason, you can't get that third measure. And so what Little's law will tell you, if for whatever reason you want that third measure, calculate the two other ones, and then you will get the third one. That's not the case in our world. It is very, 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 very easy to measure all three of the metrics that go into Little's law. It's very easy. So we have no excuse to say, oh, we don't know how to measure throughput, so we're going to measure work in progress and cycle time as a proxy for throughput. That makes almost no sense in our world. So from that perspective, yes, the equation really doesn't help us out at all. It's the assumptions. It's the assumptions under which Little's law is valid. That's where all the gold is.
Can you explain to the group, because maybe not everyone is at the same understanding of Little's law, but can you explain what those assumptions are, at least the most critical ones for our context?
Okay, hope everybody's sitting down, because this will actually take some time. It's not as straightforward as you might think, which is why I kind of did the blog post. It depends. The assumptions depend on what version of Little's Law you're talking about. Now, the original version of Little's Law, which is published by Dr. John Little in 1961, talks about a relationship between queue length, arrival rate, and wait time. Right? So it's in terms of of arrival rate, of things arriving to your process. In his original proof, in Dr. Little's original proof, all he cared about was really essentially two things. Number one, that you had an arbitrarily long time under observation, and we can talk about why that's important or not. But so number one, you have to have an arbitrarily long time. Like you can't just measure this for one day and say, hey, look, there's Little's law. It works or it doesn't work, right? It has to be an arbitrarily long period of time. But then number two, I'm going to use math terms, and it won't mean anything to anybody, but that's okay. The underlying stochastic processes have to be stationary, which essentially means that your process is stable over time, right? That some notion of system stability and an arbitrarily long period under observation. That's all he really cared about for arrival rate. Now, much later, so Dr. Little was writing in the from the perspective of operations research. If anybody has studied queuing theory and management and things like that, there's a whole section of study called operations research, when it's focused mostly on kind of the application of queuing to management itself. Then it changes to operation management, and when operations management took up, so OR and OM, when operations management took up Little's law, they said, well, you know what? Usually in our world, what we really care about is outputs. We don't necessarily care about inputs. I mean, we do care about inputs, but from a management perspective, what we really care about is outputs. So they changed the perspective of Little's law to say, hey, we're not going to look at it from arrivals anymore. We're going to look at it from departures. Well, the second you change that perspective, almost everything about Little's law changes, including, and most importantly, including those assumptions. Now, because we're looking at departures to a process, there's a whole bunch of other things that you need to consider. Things like, let me just go through them because there's 5 of them. Number one, in order to get the equation just even to work out from a math perspective, you have to have arrival rate equal to departure rate. Because the original equation was in terms of arrivals, and now this other perspective is in terms of departures, you have to have arrival and departure rate, be equal. That's number one. Average WIP can't be growing, increasing or decreasing over time. Little states that as an additional assumption. I'm not really sure why he does, because I haven't seen a data set where average arrival rate is equal to average departure rate and WIP changes. And I'm not even sure under what conditions you could have that, but hey, Little list it, so I list it too, right? Average age cannot be increasing over the period of observation. Average age can't be increasing or decreasing. Anything that enters the process has to exit the process. The expectation that if it enters, it's going to go all the way through and it is going to finish, right? It's not going to get stuck somewhere. It's not going to abnormally exit, right? It's going to exit the process normally. And then the last assumption is that, of course, you're using consistent units. And this is another one where I don't want to pick on some frameworks, but this is another one that I think really trips up agilists, because if you're measuring, cycle time in days, you can't be measuring throughput in like story points per sprint. You have to use all the same units throughout the calculation. So I don't know, it might seem kind of strange. It kind of threw me when I first read about this, but because in our world, we normally see as Little's law, average cycle time equals average work in progress divided by average throughput. That's normally how we see it. That's not the original form of the law. And because it was changed, there's a whole bunch of other assumptions that come into play that you have to understand if you want to have a decent approach at process improvement.
I'm curious about why it changed, but I want to go to an attendee question. They say maybe not a Little's law question exactly, although I think it's definitely related. how would you coach a team on initially setting their WIP limits, given that WIP is such an integral part of Little's Law?
So I used to, when I was, I think I've said this a lot, when I was first coaching teams on flow, I used to spend a lot of time on trying to get them to set those initial work in progress limits. And it was my experience anyway. I don't know if anybody else has had a different experience, that it's really, really hard if you're up against a team or an organization or a department or whatever that has never controlled work in progress before. To get them to control work in progress is difficult, if not impossible, just to get them to wrap their head around the idea. So I used to spend a lot of time trying to work with them and figure out, okay, just initially, what might our work in progress limits be? I've since given that up. I don't do that anymore. My general approach now is, let's look at aging. Most of you probably knew I was going to say this. I don't know who had 17 minutes into the webinar before Dan started talking about aging, but I have teams look at aging and how are items aging in our process, because, and Julia and I just had this conversation, I think just almost exactly an hour ago. Two of the best ways to prevent items from aging arbitrarily is to finish it or to not start it. And if you're focusing on finishing stuff and you're focusing on not starting things, well, guess what? You've just controlled work in progress. And so I would back into the whole idea of limiting WIP and controlling WIP using aging, and not get so hung up on, hey, what are the numbers that we should be using? What are the exact, what's the exact mechanism? Let's understand aging, and let's talk about, okay, how can we leverage our information about aging now to set those WIP controls? That's what I would do.
Yeah, everyone should just know that Dan and I finished a 3-day class about 30 minutes before this webinar started. So he's a trooper for hopping in and doing this today. We have a couple of questions in queue. I'll start with the first one. Since the formula of Little's Law is not recommended to be used as a measurement for system stability, if that's what you're saying, what would you recommend is the best way to measure this for your system? For example, is the best way to measure this by doing a forecast and checking to see if you successfully hit that forecast? Or is there a better way to consistently check this for your system?
Okay, yeah. So we had to be clear on terminology. I don't know that I said it's not recommended to be used as a measurement for system stability. We were talking about predictability before. And to me, in my mind, and I know somebody's going to ask this, hey, what's the difference between system stability and predictability? And we can maybe that's maybe a whole other webinar that maybe we want to get into. I think Little's Law can be used as a decent guide for system stability. And certainly if you are violating any of the assumptions of Little's Law under whatever period of observation that you're looking at, then you have pretty much by definition destabilized your system. So while the equation itself is not a good measure of system stability, looking at the assumptions that are behind the equation, will give you tremendous insight into stability. If you're really looking for how do I know whether my system is stable or not, and I guarantee this is a completely different webinar that we need to have. That's where we need to start looking at the work of Dr. Wheeler and Dr. Wheeler's work that was based on Dr. Shewart and things like process behavior charts and stuff like that. To me, that's probably a truer measure, quote unquote measure, if you will, certainly a calculation, if you will, whether your process is stable or not. So I don't know if I don't know if we can say, hey, coming to a tool near you, we will have this process behavior chart functionality. But that's
actually, it's in labs for people who have our standalone Actionable Agile subscription. If you have a subscription to analytics.actionableagile.com, if you click on the labs icon, you will find a beta version or maybe even slightly pre-beta version of a process behavior chart. And we can bring that up when we get through our Little's Law questions if we have time, for those who are interested in taking a look at that. And yeah, we can go from there. We have another question. I'll put the focus back on Dan real quick. Okay, some organizations insist on using a say-do approach, meaning plan the entire iteration or time bucket ahead and then deliver it completely. How does this correspond or conflict with these 5 assumptions of Little's Law? So the way I'm reading that, does that approach work or break Little's Law?
Yeah, I would say there's, if I'm understanding the question properly, because to be fully transparent, I'm not sure that I really kind of understand what we're going for here. But if I understand it properly, there's no correlation or no correspondence between say do and Little's Law, five assumptions. Just because you say you're going to do something from a mathematical queuing theory perspective doesn't really mean anything. So forgive me, I'm not sure that I really understand. I would never ever be able to draw a link between say do and Little's Law's 5 assumptions. So whoever posted
So
that,
let
if you
me,
can maybe help me out a little, or Julia, if you can help me out.
and no, and while they do that, they can absolutely clarify that question. I do think you sort of understood it correctly. If I have to make a big batch commitment and then I'm forced to deliver on that commitment completely, say before making another commitment, does that have anything to do with Little's Law, or is Little's Law more about how you would go about the process of delivering work, regardless if it's for that commitment or other commitments or whatever? Is that commitment process, that prioritization process, completely outside of the scope of what Little's Law is focused on?
Yeah. There's I guess there's another nuance to Little's Law that maybe we haven't discussed yet, and that is this idea that Little's Law is it's always about looking backward over a time period under observation. Little's Law will say nothing about any forecasting or any predictability, which is why, sorry, my skin ruffled up again a bit when people talk about Little's Law for predictability, because Little's actually, he's very, very clear about this. If you go and read the articles that Dr. Little has published about Little's Law, he's very, very clear. And he says, Little's Law is for looking backward. It's not for looking forward. And he's almost apologetic about it. He says, hey, it's not that that's a bad thing. It just means that we're in the measurement business. We're not in the forecasting business. So I guess that's what I'm saying. If you're making a forecast in terms of an estimation, if I can be so bold as to use those terms interchangeably, which they should not be, but if we're making an estimation about what we can do, that from a Little's Law perspective, that tells you nothing about whether that plan's achievable, whether you will achieve that plan, even if you obey the assumptions of Little's Law. So I guess that's kind of why I'm struggling. I don't understand. I can I used this example before. Like I've got dice here. I can say that I'm going to roll snake eyes, right? But that doesn't mean that I will. I'm just really struggling to connect those dots.
No, that makes sense. And I want to encourage everyone to throw your questions into the Q&A. And while we're waiting for those, I pulled up your blog post called Other Myths About Little's Law. And so one of the things that I think we all have been taught to do that you have listed as a myth is to sort of prove Little's Law using a cumulative flow diagram. So can you please talk to us about why that wouldn't be the right thing to do? I mean, that's what we've been taught, Dan. How can we all be wrong?
I will try to give a hand wavy answer to this.
You can even pull up a CFD if you want, whatever works for you.
I was trying to think if I had an animation to. Okay. Let me. Yeah. All right. Let me try to pull up a CFD and see if I can explain this. And of course, let me zoom in. Okay. And let's get rid of all this other stuff. Talk amongst yourselves. And I'll share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Let me turn on. No, let's just do system. Let's just look at system. All right. When we talk about proving Little's Law using a cumulative flow diagram. Most people will say, hey, look, you can just draw this triangle. If you care about throughput, right? You can imagine that there's a triangle drawn here. There's a line, vertical line here, and there's a slopey line here. And then we can just use all of our information about triangles to be able to quote unquote prove Little's law. And the problem with that approach is this horizontal line here represents only one period of time. It represents this, if everybody can see. Oh, I've still got European dates on, by the way. These are European dates, not American dates. This is May 1st. It represents one period of time. And what Little is concerned about is not just this one period of time, but all the intervals between whatever you think that start and end point is. So we can't just take 10 days here and whatever WIP is on May 1st. I don't know what WIP is on May 1st, 8 days. 10 divided, I can't even remember what the math was there, but we can't take the 10 days and the 8 days and do the mathematics, because what we really need to know is what's happening for every day under observation, for every day that happens in that period of observation. So we need to know what our WIP was on May 1st. We need to know what our WIP was on May 2nd. We need to know our WIP was on May 4th, right? And we need to take those averages. We need to know what our cycle time was on May 1st, May 2nd, May 3rd, and take those averages. We need to know what our throughput was on all those. So the problem with just a triangle on a cumulative flow diagram is you're just looking at, literally one reporting interval, when what Little's law says you need to take the average of everything that happens over the whole period of observation. So not sure if that hand wavy thing made any sense, but yeah, I'd be surprised if anybody can draw the triangle and plug in their numbers and Little's law works. I'd be very, very surprised about that. If it was just a coincidence.
So would you say then, even if you can't prove the formula using stuff from your cumulative flow diagram, does the cumulative flow diagram give you insights into your system stability?
Yeah, the cumulative flow diagram is simultaneously my favorite chart and my least favorite chart. I think I've talked about this a lot before. If you want to learn about flow, if what you really care about is learning about flow, then the cumulative flow diagram is the place to start and really understand how the thing is constructed and what it's doing, how it's properly constructed. And you have to do this all yourself. You can't rely on other tools to do this for you. You really have to construct a cumulative flow diagram yourself and really understand why it works the way it does. Because there's so many, shameless plug, I know, but because there's so many tools out there that don't construct cumulative flow diagrams correctly, that's why I get upset, and I try to shy away from talking about cumulative flow diagrams, because for the most part they're not constructed properly. But to answer Julia's question, if you have a properly constructed cumulative flow diagram, then you can look at the most fundamental thing you look at is, all right, roughly, is the top line on your cumulative flow diagram parallel to your bottom line, right? That gives you a pretty good idea of one of Little's law's assumption. Well, actually, technically two of Little's law's assumptions. The problem with just the cumulative flow diagram on its own, though, from an all of Little's law perspective, is this: the top line being parallel to your bottom line talks about arrival rate, talks about departure rate, talks about work in progress. It gives you absolutely no insight to aging, though. Absolutely none. So having those two lines parallel is kind of a first somewhat necessary step, but it's not sufficient. And so that's why we need to go somewhere else, which again is why I always talk about aging, because if you look at aging, by and large, you can see all of these other things.
Okay, we've got some more questions coming in. I'm just typing one thing. There's part of this question. Oh, that went away. That I wanted to ask you. So we had someone asking some things about Actionable Agile specifically. I'll just read it. So I try to measure approximate stability by using the stability part of the dashboard in Actionable Agile, but the data isn't great. It would be awesome to see, for example, average WIP age over time, which Dan, you and I have talked about that as a thing that we may deliver, or of the difference between average arrival rate and departure rate over time, which I do think we can show sort of how to look at that on the CFD. But how would you, other than the stability widget, use Actionable Agile to get a sense of stability beyond what you just went over?
You get a sense of system stability. Yeah, let's hear. I guess I can share my screen again. If everybody's seen it, there is this, I don't even know. Oh, there it is. This is the first one. I never use it, so I don't know. Yeah, one day I might, and Julia has encouraged me to do this, but one day I might talk about all the mistakes that I've made when we first started building Actionable Agile. And in full transparency and full honesty, I think this dashboard is one of them. If I could go back, I don't think I would do this dashboard. And because one of these is this this system stability metric, and I'm very sympathetic to the question, because you can see we're calculating the system stability for all of the data, at least that's what it says. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right data. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have a long enough period of time under observation. It doesn't mean a lot of things. So I'm not sure that this gives you the insight that we would want, or expect. But I might say that about all of these widgets. So
yeah, and I just put something in the chat too that we are working on revamping our charts this year, including the dashboard. So more to come on sort of making this something that you might not write that question about.
Yeah, so
that's good.
Yeah. The dashboard is definitely a mea culpa. This one, the deficiencies of this chart are completely all my fault. All my fault. And like I said, if I could go back and do it over again, I don't know that I would have bothered with it. So from a system stability perspective, number one, like I showed you, you can look at a cumulative flow diagram and say roughly are these two lines parallel. Another thing that I would do, and it's one of my favorite features of Actionable Agile, I don't know how many people use this, is this aging replay. It's like if anybody's on, play sports, it's like watching video. If you go out and play a football match and you want to watch the video of the match and see how you did, this aging replay to me is wonderful. And you can see, as you do the replay, you can see, our items aging, roughly over time. We will be bringing, I don't know if I can say this, Julia, but we will be bringing in like a WIP age run chart, at some point, which will essentially be this aging replay in more kind of a run chart format. But it's a great question. I don't know that we really have a great tool to really visualize system stability in Actionable Agile right now.
Yeah, so if you have requests about what you'd like to see, now's a really good time to put those in, because we're hoping not to remove any of the awesome value that, like, thanks, Maureen, you really like the dashboard, so we like it too. It could obviously, there's things that we want to add to it to make it even better. So we don't want to lose the awesome value that we have there. But we want to, add more. And one of the things that we're really going to be focusing on is, look, we've got a lot of data in these charts. And sometimes you have to work harder than necessarily you should have to get the insights that you can get from that data. So my goal over the next, quite a long period is to keep pulling out additional insights so that you don't have to work so hard to get the value from the charts, from the data. So we're excited to talk to people about the insights they're trying to get. And we have a lot of ideas of what we think would be good, but hearing from you all is a really good way to confirm what we think that we know. I wanted to ask you a question from anonymous attendee. Does a focus on aging inadvertently encourage teams to focus on unusually slow items early in the workflow rather than finishing rightmost items first? This makes me concerned about using the aging whip chart, but should I be? And they said, sorry, not about Little's Law. Feel free to ignore it. It's a chuckle thing because we had this exact conversation in the Agile Applying Metrics for Predictability class earlier today. So curious to see what Dan has to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because my hope is that the aging chart would do the exact opposite. My hope is that people would, when they look at, and I've got an example here, when they look at the aging chart, that the fact that they've got, all these dots here up toward the top of the chart should make the team nervous. I mean, I don't know, it makes me nervous. Maybe that maybe just speaks to my anxiety levels. I don't know, but it would freak me out if I looked at my data and I saw, all this stuff up at the top of the chart. And by the way, when your teams first load data, it probably looks much worse than this. It's not uncommon for me to see teams with items that are hundreds of days old, if not even thousands of days old, right? That kind of stuff would just, like I said, it would keep me up. It literally would keep me up at nights. And so that's the objective of the, not to make you nervous, not to make you paranoid, right? That's not the objective of the chart. But our hope is that, it places the emphasis and the focus on the ones that are the oldest. Now, if it's not doing that for you or for your team, I'd love some feedback on how we can make the aging chart better, because the default action should be, hey, let's look at these items that have aged unnecessarily, probably unnecessarily, and at least in the short term anyway. Let's talk about how we get these things done in preference for anything that is younger earlier on in the process. Because hopefully you can make the argument that if you're focusing on these things that are younger earlier on in the process, well, all that's going to happen to these things is they're just going to age more, and they're going to age more, and they're going to age more. And I say this all the time, but you have to think of, when you look at your aging chart, at least the mental model that I have anyway, when I look at the aging chart, is that every single dot on this chart is a potential dot on my scatter plot. And what is my scatter plot going to look like when these things finish, right? That's why we actually have this text here on this chart. What is my scatter plot going to look like when these things finish? And if it's going to blow my scatter plot out of the water, then I want to do whatever I can, to fix that. That's the point, is we're getting that signal much earlier. So, if anybody has any thoughts in terms of, is there a way that we can make it even more alarming to people to say, hey, these are the things that are in trouble. The things that down here are not in trouble.
We had attendees point out that the pace percentile color bands highlight the ones that are already red or not keeping pace to finish by the time that you would like to earlier in the workflow. And so that's the way that we get early signals, even if it doesn't look bad right now, because it's so far away from finish and you don't know what bad looks like that early. That's what these pace percentiles are showing you, right, Dan?
Yes.
And the stalled alert, someone said.
Yeah, I was going to say stalled alert is probably better, in my humble opinion. These pace percentiles again, and if I'm being completely honest, I've kind of gone off them because I think it encourages the wrong behavior. And we've got a good example here. Here you see this dot in analysis active. That's kind of in the orange, whatever this is, whatever the color that is. And a lot of teams might say, well, because this one's in orange, it's in more danger than, say, this one in testing, which is in the yellow. And I would say that's, for me, from looking at the aging chart, that's a wrong conclusion to draw. While this one might be at risk of finishing on time, if I had to choose between working on this item in yellow that's in test and this item that's in orange and analysis active, I would choose this one in test, every day of the week and twice on Sunday. I mean, to me, there's just no question for two very, very, very big reasons. Number one, it's older, just it's older, right? So we want to focus on the older ones first. And number two, it's so close to being done. Why would we, I'm not saying that people would, but why would you pull people, team members off of this item to go work on this one because there's a perceived risk? So anymore, again, full honesty, full disclosure, I don't even talk about the base percentiles. And I encourage people to look at the chart strictly from a pure age perspective. What's the oldest item on the chart, and kind of work through from a oldest to youngest perspective, and don't really worry so much about this stuff.
Dan, we had a question about the average arrival and average departure rates will rarely be exactly the same. And sorry, and the WIP age will be rarely exactly constant. So is there a level of variance that's considered acceptable in the sense that the system is probably still stable, even though that variance exists?
Yep, and this is where those process behavior charts come in. When we talk about what's a quote unquote acceptable level of variation in your process, ultimately we probably care about the variation in, say, cycle time, potentially age, as well, but things like cycle time, things like throughput. If we're talking about predictability, if we're talking about answering the question, when will it be done, where is that acceptable variance? That would be, to me, throwing a cycle time onto a process behavior chart and looking at it that way. Because absolutely agree, right? It's rare to almost maybe even impossible for teams to always have, average arrival rate and average departure rate equal, and to have, average age not change over time. Those they will change. And so yes, variation is to be expected. I love the observation. Variation is to be expected. The question is, how much variation is too much variation? To answer that question, you really need a process behavior chart, which, again, apologies, we don't have in Actionable Agile right now. But I want to say, I think it's great for me that we can have these types of conversations, because however 10 years ago when we started Actionable Agile, there wasn't this level of comfort with things like arrival rates and departure rates and age and things like that. So the fact that we're there and now we can start talking about, variation, and how does variation play into all this, to me, it's just a wonderful evolution of the community. I just think it's great.
Well, Dan, why don't you bring up Actionable Agile again, and you can click on the little labs button, and you can at least give people an idea of what's coming as far as the process behavior chart, because while not everyone sees it, it is something that pretty soon people will start seeing. So be good for people to see what that might look like and go from there.
And let us, thank you for pointing that out, Julie. Great idea. Let us know if anybody wants a webinar on this. I guess I would probably hold off on maybe doing the webinar until once we've got this maybe more into production or whatever. But in the coming months, hopefully before the end of the year, we can all get back together and and talk a little bit more about this, what process behavior charts are, why they're important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it would be premature to talk about, I think it'd be premature to talk about process behavior charts if we don't even know the basics of, how to measure our process and what's important and what metrics we should be tracking and things like that. I just think it's great that I think we've got that level of comfort now that, okay, a process behavior chart makes sense.
So do you want to show just real quick, like what we're looking at here?
Is it okay if we don't?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
So just so you know, this is what it looks like. It's meant to help you see what's normal variance from what's potential signal. So that's why, in relation to that question about variance, that's why I suggested, hey, you're talking about that. Let's at least show the what it looks like. And I just had someone say that, yes, I'd totally be interested on a webinar about that. So we'll schedule that to coincide with when we're releasing that. But I can send everyone, so we have documentation about this chart. And if you have access to standalone labs, you're able to do that. We've got a couple of questions left, Dan, for sure. One's a really good ending question, I think I'm going to hold to the end. But someone's apologized, which you don't need to apologize for, asking about stability, but it's one of the biggest concerns that they get when they try to roll out this process at their clients. It sounds like the recommended way is to give confidence in this process by focusing on WIP age. Is that accurate? He has clients who are stuck on story points and velocity, and it's difficult to convince them that this approach could be a more predictable solution for them, even after we implement this approach. So since they're typically focused on metrics, still a little lost on the specific data that could be used to prove that the system is stable.
Yeah, wow.
My question would be, do the ones you already have for those people prove that the system is stable?
Well, that's where I was going to go. Because I was going to have a facetious answer, and I was just going to hand it off. Usually one of two things happens when I get asked a hard question. Usually Julia's on the call, and I say, "Hey, Julia, you answer this." Or Pratik's on the call, and I say, "Hey, Pratik, you answer it." I as a rule, I don't normally answer hard questions. But yeah, I mean, I would want to know why do they think story points and velocity proves, quote unquote, proves system stability? I would have lots and lots of questions about that, or system predictability. I'd have a ton of questions about that. So the recommended way is to focus on age. It's my just to be clear, it's my recommended way to introduce this stuff. Before talking about WIP limits, before talking about WIP limits specifically, numbers, when I'm talking about specific numbers that we're using as WIP controls, I like to talk about WIP age. Now, there's probably a discussion to be had around why is limiting WIP important. That enters the conversation as well. But to me, all of that is before trying to decide what those specific numbers should be. So my preferred way is to introduce age. So I mean, one thing you could do is to kind of track both. And there's a ton of information out there where you can go, and I know, Julia, you may have written up something about this, where if you're tracking flow metrics side by side with story points and velocity type, I hesitate to even call them metrics because they're not even measurements. But if you're tracking flow metrics next to story points and velocity, and see how well they or don't correlate to each other, and you will find very, very quickly that just because an estimated story point, just because we think something is complex, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take a long time. Just because we think something is not complex doesn't mean it's going to take a short amount of time. And it's really, really not giving you much insight from a value delivery perspective. So track them side by side and see which one gives you the better answer. I know the one I would bet on, but I don't know. I hope that answers the question, but please keep asking them. Yeah, don't apologize. Please keep asking those.
Okay, one more question before this final one. So we just got a new question from a Scrum Master recently. And I guess this is relating to sort of tangentially to the stuff that we're talking about, system stability, when there are sort of special events and things like that. They would like to use like Monte Carlo simulations, for instance, but worry about the accuracy when you've got really upcoming holidays spiking or personal time off, think of Christmas or something. What would be a response to people asking those kinds of questions, if you could sum it up?
Yeah, I was going to say it was the Achilles heel of Monte Carlo, and it's not really the Achilles heel. It's just really just kind of how it is that the big assumption. I always talk about assumptions, right? Because that's the fundamental thing. Whenever you're applying a mathematical technique, whenever you're applying a tool, whenever you're applying whatever, you need to understand the assumptions that go into using that particular technique. And the biggest assumption when you're applying Monte Carlo simulation in particular is that the future that you're trying to predict roughly looks like the past that you have data for. And in this particular example, we're saying, hey, the future that I'm trying to predict does not look like the past that I have data for. Technically, by default, that eliminates your ability to use Monte Carlo. Now, there are some things that we can do to still help us with our forecast. Number one is if you do have some type of date range, historical data that does look like upcoming holidays or upcoming time off or whatever that more accurately reflects that would be the ideal thing. Number two thing that you could do, which I am fairly reluctant to recommend, but it is an option. Be a little bit more conservative, in the forecast you give. Remember, a forecast is always in terms of a range and a probability. So if you're forecasting more at the 70th or 85th percentile, maybe go up to the 95th or something, recognizing, however, that continuous forecasting is a play here, that we will change that as we get more, and we potentially will change that as we get more and better data. And then you can do, I'm saying you can do it. I'm not saying I would recommend this. You could do things like you could, just add a week on to the end of your forecast, right? But once you start doing those types of stuff, now you're in kind of, estimation land, which is, where we were before. So for me, the number one thing would be, if there's a way to try and get the historical data that more roughly reflects the future you're trying to predict, that would be ideal. If not, you'll just have to make your best guess, but then change that. This is the other part of Monte Carlo simulation that I think most people don't really talk about. You should be changing your forecast as you get more data. The idea of continuous forecasting. It's not set it and forget it.
Just really quickly, why increase the percentile range in the case that you just mentioned? Someone wanted clarification on why you would do that.
Yeah, because if we're talking about dates, then well, I guess it'd be what I mean is increasing or decreasing depending on what gives you the more conservative answer. You would tweak that percentile range depending on whether we're talking about the Monte Carlo how many or the Monte Carlo when. So it's just it's decreasing. Yeah, like I said, the percentile range. So if the 85th percentile says on or before July 1st, maybe the 95th says on or before August 1st. That's what I'm talking about. Oh.
Great. Okay, well, we're almost out of time. So I just want to ask you this closing question, and then I'll help people know where to see the blog series and where to find future events. So if you could travel back in time to when you first started applying the assumptions of Little Law, what was maybe the thing that you wish you had done differently or not repeat? And secondly, what was your biggest win? So biggest thing you wish you had known and did differently, biggest thing you're happy about that you got value from?
Wow, that's a really good question. I wish I would have discovered Little's Law earlier, because I very early on, I kind of took it for granted that how I heard others talking about Little's Law, that's how Little's Law was. And I got to give big props and a big shout out to, I mention him all the time, and we got to get him back in the community. But Frank Vega, I was talking to a guy by the name of Frank Vega. This is back in 2010. And he called me up one day, and he said, Hey, Dan, how would you explain Little's Law? I'm like, oh, easy. And it turns out it's not easy. And that set off like a 13-year obsession, for me around understanding Little's Law, because everything that I researched, other than reading, the papers by Dr. Little himself, everything that I researched, the references I found were incorrect. Were just wrong, and unapologetically, incorrect and inexact. So so it's kind of hard for me to say, because like I said, I wish I wouldn't have just assumed, like it's like the proving the triangle on the cumulative flow diagram, or the introducing the WIP limits, right? I wish, had I had the tools of Little's law, I don't think I would have fallen for those traps. So what was the other one? The other part was
It's just the biggest gain, the biggest thing that you sort of stumbled on. So you may have covered.
Oh, the thing, other than my obviously, other than my relationship with 55 Degrees and Julia in particular, and all the great conversations that I've had with Frank Vega over the years, if I could point you to like a specific reference, that the thinking, the writing that has changed my life the most, from a metrics perspective, would be the work of Dr. Donald Wheeler, and how he has extended Dr. Schuert's work. That to me, there's just so much gold. He's got a website, spcpress.com. And there's so much good stuff out there, if you're a metrics geek like I am. So
awesome. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Dan. I always learn a lot. And as the father of a tool, you know all the creaky parts and lessons learned, but we still love it. There's still lots of good things there. And with everyone's help and with Dan's help, we're going to keep making it more awesome and more fit for purpose as we go through. And as we learn as practitioners, things that help people get better, we will try to add those things to the tool that help people get better, because it's a journey. It's not a destination. I wanted to let everyone know that you can read Dan's Little's Law blog series on 55degrees.se. I put the link in the chat window for everyone. Now, I said it's a 9-post series. It sounds like a huge amount of reading, but they're pretty fast reads. So, and each one has a very specific learning objective. So it's pretty quick to get through, and you can pop in and out of the ones that you have more interest in. A good place to come talk to that. Obviously, you can talk to Dan on any of his social media channels. But you can also come to community.55degrees.se and join us there, where we have spaces to talk about Actionable Agile, everything to do with flow metrics, and also all of our other apps. In addition, you can come to 55degrees.se and go to our events page and find out about all the other events that you can join us at. And we have Q&As monthly. We're building a webinar series like this and having more and more people, both practitioners and customers and people like you, but also other types of consultants and trainers coming and giving topics that everyone can benefit from. And we're also going to be at the Agile conference in Orlando, and we're going to be having an in-person event there. So you'll find that on our website. If you're going to be in the Orlando area, please sign up to come to this free event and get some food and hear a not so drunk version of the Drunk Agile podcast with me and Dan and my co-founder here at 55 Degrees. But I want to thank you so much. And we hope to see you at our next webinar.
Can I give people a little bonus content for the people?
Thank you. I totally forgot to throw it to you, Dan. What would you like to make sure everyone knows?
Yeah. For those of you stuck around, first of all, thank you for attending. Thank you so much. I can answer this very last question very quickly.
Okay.
Does working in iterations violate assumptions of Little's law, since theoretically WIP comes down to 0? There is. Oh, and this is one thing that I did not, right? Remember I said I left some stuff out of the blog series. This is one thing that I absolutely left out. So like I said, some bonus content. There is a form of Little's law that talks about any observational period that starts with 0 WIP and ends with 0 WIP. Right? There's a special form of Little's law for this. And if you have any time period that starts with 0 WIP and ends with 0 WIP, Little's law will hold exactly. Both forms of Little's law will hold exactly between the 2 points of 0 WIP That's with 0 assumptions. You don't need any assumptions if you're starting your time period with 0 WIP and you're ending your time period with 0 WIP. Now, it turns out it doesn't really tell you anything because, you know, we're starting with 0 WIP and there's so many other problems with starting with 0 WIP and anyone with 0 WIP. But from a Little's Law perspective, it simplifies things tremendously. It's just not, in practice, not very useful. So that's it. Thank you so much for
other thing.
Yeah.
What things do you have coming up, Dan? Anything that you want to promote? People to know?
Some classes if anybody wants to learn more about, you know, the metrics here. I've got they've just regularly check the Pro Kanban website because we post new AMP classes, new metrics classes all the time there. So hope to see you all, if not in the next webinar in Orlando at the end of next month.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. I really, really appreciate you teaching us and helping us grow. I appreciate everyone else for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Bye.